Many people have a sense of the mystical, something out there, something beyond, something metaphysical, perhaps, something that we could call transcendent, something in the air that we can't maybe see or smell or taste, but maybe we can hear it or feel it. Perhaps we have a sixth sense that can perceive things that are not able to be perceived through our other five senses. Many people say, if I can't see it, I can't taste it, I can't touch it, feel it, hear it, it doesn't exist. So it begs the question, is there more to existence than what we can experience through our senses? So to begin to answer this question today, as we launch into this theme of transcendence, I want to confess something to you. Sometimes when I'm visiting someone who is dying, I will ask that person, I'll say, when you die, if it turns out that there really is a heaven on the other side of all of this, if you see my little girl, Sienna, who died, will you give her a big hug for me and tell her that her mother and her brother and I are doing okay and we love her and we think about her all the time? And I've discovered that it doesn't matter if the person is a humanist, a rational secularist, a Buddhist, or a theist, or what their background and their theology, there's something in the very humanity of that sincere request from a brokenhearted father, together with the humility of their facing their own mortality, that allows us to suspend our disbelief. It allows us to let go of our literalism, at least in that moment. And so we bathe together in the warmth and in the tenderness of that deep longing that would beg such a question. Whatever that is, or such a request, whatever that is that's special, I might even call it sacred place where people can meet in moments like that beyond our beliefs and conceptions. That's where I want us to go together this afternoon as we explore this theme of transcendence. Now, one of the things I want to mention is that it's a rarely spoken about fact that metaphysical ideas and religion and spirituality has been a part of American religion from the beginning. And it's played a really significant role in many different ways. I actually learned more about this just in the last week as I was given this sermon topic by Lynn and this book. I learned some things about how Unitarianism and Universalism were influenced by some of the metaphysical movements that have happened in our country and some of the ways in which those movements still play out in our world. And so it was really fascinating. And I want to begin by sharing with you two paragraphs from the beginning of an article that was in the New Yorker a couple years ago by Casey Sepp, who wrote, almost a third of Americans, and this is talking about right now, say that they've communicated with someone who has died. And they collectively spend more than $2 billion a year for psychic services on platforms old and new. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, television, whatever the medium, there's a medium. And like clairvoyance in centuries past, those of today also fill auditoriums, lecture halls, and retreat centers. Historic camps such as Lily Dale in New York and Casadega in Florida are booming right now, with tens of thousands of people visiting every year to attend seances and worship and healing services and readings. The surging numbers are reminiscent of the late 19th century here in this country, when somewhere between 4 and 11 million people identified themselves as spiritualists with a capital S. And that was just in the United States alone. And the United States at that time only had about 28 million people. So 4 to 11 million consider themselves spiritualists. And that's when there was also leaders. There were some hucksters among the leaders, and some of the believers were easy marks for these people. But the movement itself of spiritualism and metaphysical religion can't merely be dismissed as a collision of the cunning and the credulous. Early spiritualism attracted some of the great scientists of their day, including the physicist Marie Curie and her husband Pierre, the evolutionary biologist Alfred Russel Wallace, and the father of American psychology, William James, all of whom believed that modern scientific methods, far from standing in opposition to the spiritual realm, could finally prove its existence. So culturally prevalent was spiritualism at that time that even skeptics and dabblers felt compelled to explore it. Mark Twain, Frederick Douglass, and Queen Victoria all attended seances. The article goes on to explain that Arthur Conan Doyle, he stopped writing his highly successful Sherlock Holmes books in order to become the leading historian of the spiritualist movement, which he considered the most important spiritual movement since the life of Jesus. Great thinkers of the era like William Lloyd Garrison and Horace Greeley and his wife Mary, they attended seances. And Mary Todd Lincoln, who lost 3 of her 4 children, hosted seances in the Red Room of the White House. Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison both tried to create spirit telephones to communicate with the disembodied voices of people who had died or lived in other realms of existence or dimensions. The article goes on to name a lot of African American leaders and spiritualists of the time, including Sojourner Truth and author Harriet Wilson, among many. So in researching this message, I learned that there were a lot of, in the 19th century, Universalist ministers and their members who espoused spiritualism, and they practiced it. Also, some of the Unitarians of that era, they were attracted to it. In part, the Unitarians tend to be more rational in their religious approach, and the Universalists less so. And so on the Unitarian side, there was this idea that, well, science, this is scientific. We're beginning to be able to prove that there are other realms and that you can speak with the dead, and there is life after death. So there was some attraction among the Unitarians as well. And the Transcendentalists, of course, there was a lot of interest in mysticism and metaphysical ideas, and some of them were drawn to spiritualism. Even 2 of the greatest Unitarians of that era, William Ellery Channing and Theodore Parker, acknowledged that there was something to spiritualism. However, they never publicly associated themselves with it. So keep in mind that the Transcendentalists, many of whom were Unitarians and Unitarian ministers, were just discovering scriptures of other world religions like the mystical text of the Jewish tradition, the Zohar, and also the Hindu Vedas and the Upanishads from India and the Tibetan writings about the Bardo states after death and all kinds of other ideas of reincarnation from Eastern religion. These things were just making their way into American libraries and into the American consciousness, that there were religions other than Christianity and scriptures other than the Bible that were filled with all kinds of different ideas about spirituality and the afterlife. So there was a great growing interest, including a growing interest for the first time in a more positive way among many about Native American spirituality. Which, of course, has a lot of ideas about connecting with ancestors after death and connecting with spirits that are not in this same physical, material plane. So what we see happening is probably something that a lot of us can relate to, which is these folks were no longer convinced of orthodox religious ideas from Christianity in their times, but they were also not satisfied with a completely materialistic view of existence. So they were drawn to learning and experimenting with other kinds of spirituality and other ideas that were metaphysical, ideas and practices. Now, Emerson and the transcendentalists used the word intuition to talk about a way of experiencing reality that went beyond the senses, the five senses. So they used intuition, that word, a little differently than we do today, but the idea was that there was a way of knowing that we could connect to that wasn't just the eyes, ears, and taste, smell, and all of that. In that era, there was a growing interest and also a lot more access to things like astrology and tarot and psychics. And unfortunately, like in every era, there are people who took advantage of these interests, and they specifically took advantage of grieving people who were missing those who had died. The Civil War had a big influence on this because so many young people died and families wanted to connect and talk to them again and say some last words or communicate and find out how they were doing and what was going on. Many people found ways to make money from exploiting people who didn't know any better and who were vulnerable and sad. And due to the exploitation that happened, many of these ancient practices and techniques were given a bad name and they were discredited and they fell out of popularity. The famous magician and illusionist Harry Houdini, he was well known for going around and debunking the different mediums and psychics and exposing their tricks. So he took it upon himself to go around and disguise himself and go in and figure out what the ones that were doing this falsely and really show, oh, this is how they do it and here's how it's done. And he exposed a whole bunch of folks. Now, even though he did that, before he died, Houdini and his wife Bess agreed that if Houdini found it possible to communicate after death, that he would communicate the message to her, Rosabelle Believe, a secret code that they agreed to before he died. And apparently Rosabelle was their favorite song. And it said that Houdini's wife held a yearly seance on Halloween night every year for 10 years after his death. And in 1936, after a last unsuccessful seance, Bess finally put out the candle that she had kept burning beside a photograph of her husband since he died. And in 1943, Bess gave up and said, 10 years is long enough to wait for any man. Now, as more and more of these mediums and practices were exposed as frauds, you can see Universalist clergy and Unitarians turning against spiritualism. Perhaps the most famous Unitarian clergy of that time and former Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson, he once described spiritualism as midnight fumblings over mahogany. He was referring to the seances where spirits were supposedly knocking on the table, knock once for yes, knock twice for no, and sort of some of these were exposed as frauds. Two of the famous sisters who were doing that, one of them admitted later that she could crack her knuckles in her hands and her feet and make a loud pop at will. And that's how she did it. So these things began to get a bad name. Nevertheless, Emerson himself is known as one of the pioneers of metaphysical thinking, both back then and even today in New Thought, New Age, and of course in various Unitarian churches as well, particularly because of his book titled Nature, which really outlined a lot of his spiritual and metaphysical ideas. So let's consider the question before we close about, from the beginning of this message, is there more to reality than we can experience through our five senses? The physical world, of course, is full of rocks and trees and stars. But what we have to acknowledge is that we don't experience these things fully or directly. We experience only our perception of them. So what do I mean by that? For one thing, scientists tell us that what we perceive as solid are really made up of moving particles and atoms. That really, this isn't so solid, that there's moving particles and atoms with space in between them, in here and in a rock and in the wood and all these other things. But that's not how we perceive them. It seems pretty darn solid to me. So keep in mind that we have 5 senses that allow us to perceive reality, but those senses also filter reality. For example, we as humans can see only 3 colors in combination. I think some people, very small slice, can see 4, but most of us can only see 3. But there are other animals that can see 4, 6, and even some insects that can see 16 colors. There's a lot more here than we can see. We know that our dogs can smell and hear things that we can't. If there was a dog here right now, it would be having a very different experience than you're having. You and I only experience a small bandwidth of reality that we can perceive through our 5 senses, which are limited. There are ultraviolet rays and traveling around, infrared, right here. We can't see them. We don't even know they're here if we didn't have other instrumentation that helped us understand that. There are radio waves and Wi-Fi and stuff flowing through us and around us. We can't see any of it. It's here. The point being that if we reduce our entire belief system only to things that we can see, feel, hear, taste, and touch, then we're admittedly, that's fine, but we're admittedly missing a lot of reality that's out there that we're not able to pick up. So we experience the world through a uniquely human dimension. But there's a lot more that we don't see. Now, it doesn't mean that we should believe everything we hear and read and everything we see on the internet about spirituality. We still need ways to try to figure out what is real and what's not, and what's meaningful to us and what can help us to live a better life, what can lead us to love and be loving. We need ways to judge what's real and what's not. However, I think humility about what we know and what we don't know is a really wise way to approach these bigger topics of spirituality and the metaphysics and what happens after people die. Even the leading scientists tell us that they believe dark matter and dark energy makes up 80 to 90% of the cosmos, and they don't even know what it is. And they can't even prove that it exists. And yet a majority of astrophysicists and cosmologists are all agree that it's there. So I want to encourage you to look for ways to expand your consciousness, expand your perception so that you can try to see and experience as much of reality as is possible in this human life that we have. Meditation is one of the things that I've used for many years as a way to try to connect and expand my understanding of what's real. I find that to be really beneficial. I do that every day, but there's lots of different ways. For 24 years, I've been leading classes and workshops and things here at All Souls. And I've asked people, have you ever had a spiritual experience or something you would call a transcendent experience? And some people, a very small group of people say, no, I've never had one. I don't know what you're talking about. But most people have had some kind of experience. Some people will say that it happened while they were watching a sunset, or they were up on a mountaintop somewhere, or somewhere out in nature. For others, it involved music or ritual or running a marathon. For some, it happened while they were alone. For other people, it happened while they were in community with others. I know folks who personally experience powerful spiritual moments in Pentecostal and charismatic worship. Things that included, for some people, speaking in tongues and prophecy. There are people who've had experiences that have convinced them that they've lived past lives and that they can remember some of those past lives. Some of us believe in heaven. Some of us believe in reincarnation. There are a lot of people with Native American heritage here at All Souls who have had amazing experiences of spirits or ancestors. I've heard stories of inexplicable things about encounters with astrology, telling people things about their life that they had no idea could be possible, or through psychics. Others have experienced what they would consider God or the oneness of the universe through psychedelic drugs. Our congregation aims to be a safe place where people can be honest about their experiences and their beliefs, and where we can all be curious and we can all learn from each other. Nobody's expected to believe something just because someone else believes it, or to not believe something just because someone else doesn't believe it. Even including the ministers. Just because I say it doesn't mean you have to believe it. We don't have a dogma like that in this congregation, that there's no requirement to be a member of All Souls that you believe or disbelieve something. You're free to follow your life experience and your conscience and your relationship with whatever it is that you consider real. Here, that's why we say we love beyond beliefs. We give each other the freedom to believe or not to believe, which means that we can each be honest about our beliefs, and we can each hopefully be humble as we encounter other people's beliefs and ideas, by accepting that there's a lot more to life and to death and to reality than we could ever possibly know. For me, that makes this a very rich community, very colorful community of people engaging in some of the most meaningful ways with one another. Now, for me, I'll just be honest, I'm agnostic about what happens after we die. I'm more like Henry David Thoreau, who said, I'm just going to take it one life at a time. I know I'm alive here, and so I'm sort of focused on this life rather than thinking about the next life. But nevertheless, I want to end with a story about the afterlife, or life after death, or something like that, that comes from my own experience. So after my daughter, Sienna, died in 2006 at the age of 3, unexpectedly and very suddenly, I was following a workbook on grief that suggested that I write her a letter to share with her anything that I might have wanted to tell her that I didn't get a chance to tell her. And the suggestion was that you do it with free writing, where you put the pen or pencil down on paper and you just start writing whatever comes into your mind, and you just keep the pencil moving and writing whatever words sort of come into your head. And I'm going to tell you, it was amazing. I wrote this letter, very cathartic and powerful and emotional, and I wrote this letter and I got some things said that I needed to say. And then the next exercise, though, was even more impactful. Next, what I was instructed to do was the same free writing technique, but this time to do it addressed to myself, imagining that Sienna was writing a response to my letter. And that's what I did. Pencil hit the paper, and about a page and a half later, I set it down. I wrote what I could hear, what I felt like I could hear her words in my head, my daughter's voice, responding to me, comforting me, reassuring me. Now, she was only 3 years old when she died. So this wasn't exactly a 3-year-old's vocabulary or thinking. And yet, it felt exactly like what she would have said to me in response. Was she communicating from another plane of existence? As I said, I'm pretty agnostic about that. But what I feel I know, and what I feel I can hang on to in doing that exercise, is that I found her voice inside of me. And I have been left with a sense that she is a part of me. And that despite her untimely death, she wants me to be happy. So whatever it is that inspired the spiritualist movement in the late 18th and early 19th century in this country, whatever it is that sparked this new wave of the same kinds of things, thinking and practices, it's an impulse that I imagine is universal. Since we humans are alive and we know we're going to die, we're conscious that we're going to die, and everybody we love and know is going to die. That because of that experience, we long to bridge the gap between ourselves and those we have lost. And whether we believe it literally or not, perhaps we hope on some level that they are thinking of us as much as we are thinking of them. At the very least, we like to be assured that the connection lives on. And I think we imagine, and sometimes we intuit, that there's a lot more going on here than we will ever be able to fully prove. Now, you know, if it's true and you get there before I do, you know what I want you to say to my precious girl, Sienna. And I just want to say to you, I love you, and I hope we can all be open and humble in our spiritual approach and in our relationship with others. Thank you.